joining us. I guess I need to first answer the existential question for a Sunday morning, why are we here? And that leads me into thanking Emmanuel for allowing me to join this network, partly because it allowed me to think creatively about how you marry actually two sets of literature that haven't really spoken to each other in the past, right? Which is borders and migration studies. And Michael is not here, Michael Carleton. We're currently editing a book that is exactly on this, right? What can we learn respectively from these different sets of literature? And looking through for example, studying this through the refugee crisis is, I think, a very fruitful way for rethinking certain issues. And the first one is that what Borders Studies does is to look very closely at the material reality at borders, at practices. How is the flow of people across borders organized? What comes out of this? Whereas migration scholars mostly look at borders as something that is pretty static and that is primarily tied to the power of the sovereign nation state to either deny people entry, to regulate naturalizations, and so forth. But often migration scholars don't really see how the borders evolve and also open new opportunities. And there's a certain built-in bias in migration studies to look at borders, and mostly it is seen to be a kind of, this is a site of human rights violation, that's exclusion, right? They look at borders as basically sites where the state practices a slightly doubtful form of repression vis-a-vis people who try to cross borders. Security is often tied, to a particular literature and a particular perspective, not realizing also how the management or the governance of borders has opened new opportunities. If you think about the European Union, and that brings me to the second dimension where migration scholars come in, and myself, looking at the politics of migration. Right? You realize that borders, beyond being a site of policies, of government practices, also have this eminent symbolic dimension as sites of negotiating legitimate forms of belonging, what is the legitimate border of the community, its identity, and borders in this respect play a crucial role, a reference point in negotiating, who legitimately belongs, who should be able to cross. And so, how do you bring these two together? This kind of symbolic, this symbolic dimension of borders and the practices on the ground. If we look through the refugee crisis, it is quite fascinating to see the disjuncture, which then speaks to the politics of migration and borders as well. Look at what is happening. In 2015, 2016, clearly we've seen an extraordinary situation on the ground where you had hundreds of thousands of people coming into Europe. And that has, if you think about the politics, has also triggered a kind of, we're going to call it this way, a nationalist backlash across Europe in terms of saying, look, we've lost control over the border, we need to reestablish the sovereign nation state as a guardian of security, of protecting our community, that something has gone wrong. We have seen reaction on the ground. Emmanuel referred to this. Frontex has been greatly expanded. But what we now see is, and I think, Emmanuel, you left us with this last night, you spoke about the politics of place. That's what's happening at the moment, that the border becomes a reference, a place where these political fights are fought. And what you see is, and it's not by accident, that populist and nationalist forces across Europe has discovered the border as a site where to stage their rhetoric about who belongs and who doesn't, who is the foreigner. Think about here in the United States. It's not by accident that the border has become the key issue in the Trump campaign. He's not really interested in security. He's not looking at what makes our country more secure, how can we control drugs and illegal crossing of borders. It is really the border as a site for a kind of a nationalist cause to say, we don't want any more immigration, we want a different kind of society. And that's what you see in Europe as well. The symbolic dimension of fighting over borders, kind of borders as, if you want, a stage, right, on which those debates about the legitimate borders and the identity of the community are being fought over. What is now fascinating, if you look at the literature, is to also think about the performative effects of those discourses on, then again, border controls and border practices. Because once you have a discursive environment in which the border is essentially seen in very existential ways as, the place where, the security of the own community is being negotiated, where sovereignty is at risk and so forth. You can see how this then has an effect also on how we deal with those borders. Think about currently the refugee crisis in Europe. These numbers now have gone down to relatively modest levels, right? So it's more in the tens of thousands of people. Still, very dramatic, trying to cross the Mediterranean. The humanitarian crisis is ongoing. But the numbers as such are relatively small. But think about the rhetoric at the moment that we have in the public sphere. It is still as if, our security is being compromised, our borders are being opened. We need to invest, heavily into this. There is a disjuncture between the discursive symbolic dimension and the reality on the ground. That's fascinating to study as a scholar, in the interplay between borders and migration. And, so that we see so much emphasis on strengthening borders in a particular way has to do also with a successful way in which populist and nationalist actors across Europe and North America have appropriated this kind of issue and given it a particular dimension, which is often really largely disconnected from the realities on the ground. If you speak to people, border agents, what they wanted, and the rhetoric that we have in the political arena, these two things are, a very interesting way of how they are related. And I think that's what our network has contributed, and hopefully some of the publications that are coming out now as well, is to see, how do we debate this? What are the effects of these public debates, and how, in a way, also the practices on the ground with respect to borders could, in a way, set a different kind of reality. And think about the European Union, and just maybe let me end on this. That's not a tribute to those people financing this workshop, but if you just for 1 minute, maybe that leads into Berta's presentation. Think about what European integration is all about. Why is it that borders were at the center of how the European integration project started? Why is cross-border mobility one of the fundamental freedoms of the European Union? Because on the one hand, you could say this is about facilitating trade, mobility across border, but it's also a kind of a vision of how this community ought to, to look like, its internal composition, a kind of a cosmopolitan spirit that came with the idea of doing away with borders within the Schengen Agreement, right? So I think that's what is at stake at the moment in the political fights. How do we want to have our community composed? What is the role of diversity? And what is Europe? Do we go back to a Europe of exclusionary nation states, where there isn't really a place for much diversity? Or I think what is built into the very European notion of a border-free Europe is also kind of underlying willingness to rethink, the exclusive notion of, we're only defined by national belongings, is there a different form of citizenship? So in this respect, borders are at the very center of those competing visions of political community. And I leave you with this. I think, Berta, that might be relevant to your presentation.
Thank you.